Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started today. Thanks so much for being here. I know I hate to break up the conversation. Thank you for being here in the room, and we have over 150 people on the phone as well, so we want to be mindful of them. And thank you in cyberspace, on behalf of our cybersecurity visitor, for being here. I'm Cindy Lewin. I'm the co-chair of the nonprofit organization's practice group here at Venable. We're very lucky to have one of the largest and award-winning, so one of the best. I'm not just saying that. Other people are saying that too. One of the largest nonprofit organizations practice groups. We try to be one-stop shopping here at Venable for our nonprofit clients and do everything that they might need. And we have a lot of people in the nonprofit group, but we also rely heavily on our experts from around the firm. And we're very lucky to have Lindsay Meyer here with us today. And since I started at Venable, I've been calling Lindsay constantly. I mean, the world is getting smaller. The world is flat. And all of our nonprofits, almost all of them, are becoming global in one way or another, even if they're small. I was just talking at our table about an organization I was representing that very small, only had 4 employees, but managed to have one of those employees in Argentina, one in Belgium, one in the UK, about to Brexit. So that complicated thing, and one in the US. And their world was challenging. But Lindsay, I've called you about licensing arrangements. I've called you for people who want branches overseas, who want offices overseas, who want to have employees overseas, who don't want to have employees overseas but want to work overseas. And then we had that giant China thing where China tried to set down the trade association's major annual event, 10 days before, and that was before the coronavirus. But luckily, nothing's been happening in international trade. We have a totally predictable foreign policy. We have no tariff wars, no issues of any kind.
Easy breezy.
You've been sitting on your heels.
Exactly.
So with that, and I should mention Lindsay's been recognized as a DC super lawyer for many years running. So again,
thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction that my mother would be very proud of. So welcome everyone. Today we're here to talk about some international issues, and the world has changed. I've been doing this for a fair bit, and I have to say that over the last 3 years, things have... Is this supposed to echo like that? Wow. Okay, let me take it a step back then. No, it's on. Okay, well, you can all hear me well. Things have definitely been ramped up in terms of trade policy, the challenges and difficulties in predicting trade policy. I think more of a nationalistic approach has certainly been imposed not only in this country but in other countries. And at the same time, most operations, for-profit, non-profit, are looking for opportunities globally. And I certainly think that that will continue to expand and evolve. So when you have those two challenges, it makes for practical difficulties in navigating what are either regulatory or new rules that might be imposed, as well as trying to really just meet your mission and goals. So with that, we're going to talk a little bit about the world today, some of the trade trends that I'm seeing, some of the issues that come up, and frankly, talk about in practical terms some of the ideas to issue spot and give you some suggestions on how to best navigate them. Because we are here in Washington, D.C., I have a tendency to slip into Washington speak of acronyms. If I do that, please raise your hand or jump in on the phone and let me know if you don't understand one of the acronyms I'm using. So that would be very helpful. So let's get started. So our roadmap for today, we're going to talk a little bit about global trends, in particular one that is impacting, I think, everyone, coronavirus. We're going to focus on that, given the novel effect impact, figure out how we can best deal with that from a practical standpoint. Think about marrying your goals of your organization with the potential opportunities for formation overseas. What we generally see is it's an evolution. People put their toe in the water before, diving in with their whole body into the ocean. We're going to talk about foreign jurisdictions, understanding kind of some of the impacts that we see, notwithstanding the fact that your missions are for nonprofit charitable foundation goals. The business has to run, so there are always tricks with that from a personnel standpoint, from a money flow standpoint, from a tax consideration and nonprofit status. So we'll talk about that. Can't talk about the world and operations without discussing corruption. Over the years, that has continued to be a high watermark in terms of both enforcement and focus. Traditionally had been strong in the U.S., and everybody else said, this is just the way we do business, and that's no longer the story. We're also going to talk about some other U.S. law considerations that people don't always have top of mind when you're looking to go overseas with your activity. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll wrap it up with some compliance considerations that you can think about implementing, as well as some real-life examples, because, frankly, fact is stranger than fiction in many regards. Okay, so let's just jump in on the latest and greatest, the coronavirus, which hit quickly, unexpectedly, unfortunately, at a time when it coincided with the Chinese New Year and a lot of movement within Asia that also corresponded with the kickoff of a new year, which also brings a lot of new organizations having their annual meetings and other activities globally. So the timing probably could not have been worse, a bit of a perfect storm. So I want to just chat a little bit and see how it might impact or how it is impacting your operations overseas. We do know that the World Health Organization declared it a public health emergency of international concern. And here in the U.S., the Department of Homeland Security also imposed some restrictions in terms of travel and routing. So those are interesting. And what they tell you is, okay, this is something that is significant. If you are going to be having a meeting, okay, maybe you didn't have it in January, but maybe you've got a meeting scheduled in, Shanghai in early March. What do you do? What do you think about? Do you go forward? Do you cancel it? Can you cancel it? Can you relocate? All of these considerations. So from my perspective as a lawyer, you say, okay, can we get out of it? What are the implications? Would it be considered a force majeure? Force majeure, as you may know, is kind of an act of God or an unexpected crisis that arises. And depending upon where you sit and what law might apply to your contracts, there might be different answers. So coronavirus is obviously a new impact here. The most recent example that we could look to is what happened in the SARS impact, right? So there was a dispute that was litigated, and a hotel brought an action against an organization that was trying to move forward or didn't want to move forward with their activities, and they claimed breach. On the other hand, the organization said, no, it was force majeure. And as it turned out, they ended up settling. But the impact there was, at that time, SARS was limited more to hospitals. Here it has, under coronavirus, it has a broader impact. While it started, and most of the activity certainly is in hospitals, as we've also seen, it's now extended to cruise ships, that are floating and trying to find a home port, among others that are situated at a particular port. So if you're thinking about something like this, if you've got a situation, an emergency or something that's unexpected, you want to give some thought. Obviously, the folks who are involved in dealing with coronavirus are looking most particularly at their agreements. So what do their agreements say? Is there a force majeure provision? What type of activities does it cover? Does it identify? I think over the course of the years, we've seen more expansive force majeures to try and predict the unpredictable, if you will. From a U.S. law perspective, it's our observation that the courts tend to interpret those more narrowly. So that's not favorable if, you don't have some hook within your language to attach it to. On the other hand, I know that in China, a certain part of the government, the Legislative Affairs Committee, the Standing Committee of the National Public Congress, identified that because of the severity of the coronavirus, that it should be regarded as force majeure. So if you've got a contract that has China as the applicable law, you might have, a more favorable reviewing there. So then you'd say, okay, well, when is our meeting planned for? Is it next week? Is it next month? You might have two different outcomes there. In addition, you may say, well, is there any insurance that we have that would cover this? Again, you go back to the papers to see what the impact would be. And then, frankly, you also have to think not only about your organization and the attendees, but also the service providers. It's not just the hotel, but it's other services that typically you need to look to in country. Is your meeting going to be in Singapore versus in Beijing or, heaven forbid, Wuhan? So there are a number of different factors that you would need to consider. We have seen instances where in some places they're able to shift location, move it from Asia to another location where it wouldn't be terribly disruptive. But again, you have to have lead time to allow the attendees to make different arrangements. Yes, question.
When you said U.S. law enforcement majeure is narrow, so if you're saying a template force majeure, that unfortunately may not say
Epidemic.
Health or epidemic.
Right. So the question for those on the line is with regard to the U.S., my comment that U.S. courts tend to interpret them more narrowly. So if you don't have some language that's a hook, if for example, your force majeure does not say epidemic, I think you have a harder row. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's, out of the box. And then you would look to other government action that would help support your case. So the Department of Homeland Security, I would look to certainly China, although that would not be precedential. But you would put together those facts as you best can if you feel that you need to rely on a force majeure comment. Cindy?
It's been interesting to watch these force majeure clauses develop because I remember it used to just say strikes, and then there were a lot of different ways that then we added labor disputes. And then, of course, we started adding acts of terrorism, and now we're going to add all of these other things. And yet they all end with something that says, and all other acts of God are beyond the reasonable control of both parties. And I worry that we're maybe it's just better to say acts of, the more we specify, the more there's an argument that something we left out was left out deliberately. And yet I think it's very hard as lawyers to figure out what the right answer is. But yeah, they're getting really long, and we're all learning to add by what's happening.
So it'll be interesting to see. I think more so than SARS, the impact of SARS wasn't as widespread and broad in terms of impact, time, geography. I think there will be case law that'll develop out of this that'll give a broader roadmap. But again, you have to look and say what law applies first off. Are you talking U.S. law? Are you talking law of the potential location, be it China, Singapore, and the like? So you would want to see what government interaction or intervention or decisions or pronouncements have been made there to potentially bolster.
The impact on, if 5% of your attendees were coming from China and now you're going to lose 5%, that's very different than if you're having the event in China. And we are getting these calls already about events and exactly about this, so very timely.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because you think about, your personnel traveling. So even if you weren't hosting an event, if you've got meetings scheduled and the like, is there an ability to make modifications so you don't put them at risk, but also continue to engage in your operations and your support? So they're very complicated issues. I think we'll see better instances and better guidance come out of it, unfortunately, because of the widespread impact. So I just wanted to lead off with that because we're all hearing about it, reading about it, and it's just life today. So I think when you're talking about going overseas, many organizations have already started that and have begun operations overseas, and others are just contemplating it. We see the whole spectrum and range. Generally, I like to just level set and make sure whether you've been operating internationally for a significant amount of time or whether you're just thinking about expanding your operations overseas. I think it's good to periodically kind of level set and figure out if the goals of what you're trying to achieve with your organization are married up with your level of engagement, your level of interaction in country, the level of potential liability and responsibility that's associated with that. So I think, even if you've been operating internationally for several years, and we've got many clients who are in that category, it's smart to take a step back periodically and just make sure that what you're doing and how you're doing it comports with your mission and goals, because like anything, operations and the goals continue to evolve, as do the restrictions that can apply. So I think it's smart to think about issues such as, do you have a short-term engagement that's required for your mission? Do you have a longer term? Are you going to start? Generally, what we see is people will start in a more focused and narrow, almost a test case, if you will, to see how it is, to see if what you think you can achieve there is feasible in the manner that you've identified. And then if so, continue to expand. If you find that, no, our mission isn't being successful in this initial approach, then you can kind of regroup without going, too far afield. Oftentimes we see folks that will partner with another organization that is doing similar work. That's a nice, easy intro. You don't have the broad exposure to on-the-ground liability, responsibility, and the like. But there you have to choose wisely, because your reputation and your organization's reputation will be tied to the entity that you select. So I think that's an important thing to think about. And then there are always, and you'll get this thread throughout, it's the money. Even though you're in nonprofit organizations and operations, you have to have the funding to support that. And the movement of money internationally can be challenging. So I don't want to harp on that, but I think as a practical matter, it's important to keep that in mind. And whether or not you have a bank account locally that can support local employees, whether you have restrictions on that, whether you are going to be in a position to remit any of the funds that have been sent overseas. All of those issues need to be contemplated. And then just charting out what activities do you plan to do. Is your focus educational? Will you need to get attendees? Can you get membership? Can you solicit for membership? All of these have potential restrictions based on the local environment and government operations. So I think you want to just go in with what are your set of objectives and how can you best meet those. Whether it's a new operation or whether you've been doing it for 10 years, it's nice to take a step back and just kind of refresh on that. Okay, so just in terms of the operations themselves, we've seen instances where people will test the water by doing a one-time conference. And they say, well, do we have to register if we're doing a one-time conference? Because a lot of organizations don't want to make the commitment until they know, yes, we want to charge forward. Generally, most jurisdictions, you can do a one-time conference and not have all of the liability and responsibility of formal registration in a particular jurisdiction. Of course, I'm going to drop a footnote here, and every jurisdiction is different, either at the federal level, provincial level, regional level. So you would obviously want to make sure that your identified location is clear on that. But for the most part, from a very general standpoint, we do see that one-time operations often will be permitted. If you're in the business of setting up organizations, trade fairs, and the like, engaging someone who can assist you with that often is beneficial, particularly if it's early on in your international sphere. Joint ventures and the like as well. All of these, you have to be probably more careful of who your partners are than you would from a U.S. perspective. You have less oversight and control because they're, frankly, a bit further away. You should do your due diligence on the parties that you're going to interact with, and particularly those where you're going to formally, go into a joint venture with. So there are issues about how formalized you start your operations overseas, whether you have to register, want to register, what will it then take if you want to unwind that? That can be challenging. So these are just some things to think about. And then probably most importantly, what does the funding look like to support your activities overseas? So again, these aren't all the answers, but these are just some ideas for you to think about as you're looking overseas. Probably the second biggest topic after the, follow the money is on the employment side. How do we get the support of personnel to engage in our mission? we'd like to bring someone from the U.S., from our operation in the U.S., and we'd like to put them over in country X, but we want to make sure that they have the benefits that are, that they have here. So it's as if they're operating in Washington, D.C., but they're in Abu Dhabi. So all of those issues can be solved, but you want to think about it before they're like jumping on a plane to start their activity. Usually it will take a little bit of time, a little bit of structure. So whether it's a secondment where the employee is an employee of the U.S. operation but seconded to the international organization overseas, that's one common area where you can provide the support. You have to be careful of some of the tax issues. Point of clarification, I am not a tax lawyer. However, we have fabulous international tax lawyers that we regularly confer with at Venable, who have also spoken with me on this topic. So the tax issues are important. You want to make sure that you're not subject to double taxation. You want to see whatever treaties are applicable, so that the person isn't in an adverse position, working overseas than he or she would be if they were working here. So I think on that, you also want to give some thought to, is a shared services model for some of the operations feasible, where you may have kind of the back office support here that you can provide those services to the local organization without having to have a body in country supporting that operation. So again, for starting off, these are a lot of the issues that we see that are significant for purposes of operations overseas. The other thing you want to also keep in mind is there a requirement for a local, a true local representative? We tend to see that more if you've got a formal organization set up there, a formal entity. There are certain jurisdictions that require, local input, local ownership or the like, whether it's in a controlling manner on a board or whatnot. So again, that's another factor. The other thing that you have to think about with personnel overseas is that unlike in the States, for the most part, overseas you can find someone who wears multiple hats. So they might be president of company A, they might be the chair of foundation B, and they might be the minister of health all at the same time with a lot of hats on their head. So you want to have clarity in terms of, who precisely you're dealing with, not only from the due diligence standpoint, but what other roles are they currently engaged in, because that too can have some impact and potential blowback. So additional tax considerations, obviously the movement of money. It's always very easy to move money into a particular country. It's oftentimes very hard to extract it. So you don't want to put in more capital in an investment than you need, but you also need to have obviously opportunity for cash flow as appropriately needed. Again, potential issues for tax implications and foreign exchange considerations. And then ultimately, you don't want to kill the golden goose, meaning you want to make sure that whatever business activities or operations you're performing overseas don't adversely impact your nonprofit status in the U.S. So we have seen instances where a U.S. nonprofit can set up a for-profit organization overseas, and if it's done correctly, it doesn't impact the nonprofit status here. On the other hand, if you decide to open a foreign branch, which is in a separate legal entity, there can be implications. So again, you want to be thoughtful as you go into these different opportunities. And always, if you think, oh, this will be a month to get done, times 3, it'll be 3 months. If you think it's going to cost $10,000, it'll cost, $20,000. So be optimistic but realistic as you're charting things out. People are like, okay, well, I want to start on March 1st, and you're like, okay, that's great. It's February 20th. That's not realistic, but let's regroup and reframe. Okay, so working overseas, as I kind of tip the hat to with Dealings internationally, probably the biggest issue we've seen lately has been with regard to corruption. What I have on the screen now is called the heat map, and this is put out by Transparency International. Every year they rank the countries. The cooler, the yellow, the very clean and non-corrupt, the hotter and darker the red, the more corrupt. You'll note that the U.S. is not a light yellow. And in fact, while Denmark has historically ranked as number one, U.S. is at number two in terms of the level. There is some level of corruption. Some people, okay, I'm not from New Jersey, but some people say, well, maybe it's New Jersey. I don't know. I love New Jersey, but all kidding aside, there are considerations for corruption, and the U.S. can put forth different laws and enforcement, and yet, I don't think that we live in a completely glass house that's free and clear either. So
really ugly map.
It's a really ugly map. Yeah. So if you look at it, you're like, wow, okay, this is challenging. And so you want to have an awareness as to where precisely you're looking to do business, because in many parts of the world, baksheesh, whatever you want to call it, has been kind of a manner of course. And so the U.S. law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, was implemented many moons ago in 1977. So we've had this law for many a year. But frankly, the enforcement and the acknowledgement internationally has really just come into being within the last 5 or 10 years. And finally, other countries have now begun to enact their own national legislation that mirror this. In large part, the OECD put forth a multilateral agreement that many countries signed that said we will support and engage in anti-corruption legislation. And what's interesting, people think, well, there's a lot of corruption in Asia and in China. Well, China has very strong anti-corruption laws, and they will also go after Chinese individuals and entities as well as non-Chinese. So it's kind of equal opportunity for enforcement. So just to give everybody a little bit of a high overview, so the anti-corruption that U.S. persons, meaning individuals, U.S. organizations, for-profit, not-for-profit, all alike, as well as people undertaking activity here in the U.S., that's the jurisdiction. The laws, I'm a U.S. citizen, so the laws follow me whether I'm sitting in Washington or whether I take a trip over to Copenhagen. So they follow us and our dealings globally. Same is true, obviously, for not-for-profit entities that have been established within the U.S. The key provision, there are two sides of the house. For publicly traded companies, there are these record-keeping provisions that basically say if you're going to bribe, make sure you record it correctly. And if you do that, ironically, you wouldn't violate the record-keeping provisions. But I have yet to see anyone, bribe $10,000, Minister of Commerce. Haven't seen that. But if it were there, it wouldn't have been a violation. For purposes of our discussion here, though, the other side of the house is the anti-bribery provisions that apply to U.S. persons, and it prohibits paying or offering to pay. So you don't even have to make the transaction, just the offer of payment of money or quote-unquote anything of value, which has been broadly interpreted, with corrupt intent. Okay, corrupt intent is, basically written in as presumed, directly or indirectly, so whether you do it or whether you have somebody else do it on your behalf, to a foreign government official, political party official, so anyone within that sphere, for the purpose of influencing their act or decision, or for the purpose of obtaining or retaining business for any improper advantage. So that's generally the rule. I can say that the corrupt intent is generally presumed.
Yeah, it would be hard for me to bribe you and not expect you to
do something for
right.
it. Yeah. And what's interesting in the US law, it includes foreign government official. That's not to say that we have laws that prohibit commercial bribery as well. It's just not within the scope of this. For instance, the UK Bribery Act does not have the limitation of foreign government official. It's just bribery, more broadly defined. And for example, if even as a U.S. entity, if you have a presence in the UK, even if it's just a person and a phone, you are also within the scope of that act as well. So that they have a little bit slightly broader definition in terms of their application. We in the U.S. under the FCPA, we have some certain limited exceptions. For example, there's the rule that allows for de minimis payments, but that is not recognized globally. So the opportunity to say, well, it was just a small payment, it was de minimis, so it shouldn't apply. We have seen cases where the small payments, a company needed to bring in personnel, and they needed a significant number of personnel, and in order to get them, they needed permits. So they had to go to this government official to get the permits. And so they said, well, we're just going to give a little bit, $10 here, $10 there. Well, given the number of permits that they needed, yeah, it was de minimis if you looked at it individually, but collectively, it was significant, and DOJ said, can't do that, my friend. So you have to be careful about that, and really the exceptions that we have in the U.S. aren't acknowledged elsewhere. So it's not necessarily a safe harbor. So with the FCPA, as we saw on the heat map, you want to be careful of the countries that you're dealing in, because some are hotter than others, if you will. Some have some red flags attached to them just because there have been many instances of corruption identified and cases brought. You also have to be careful of who is a foreign government official. It can also extend to family and friends. So let's say you want to bring over, let's say you're thinking about starting an organization in, we'll just say China, and you want to bring over folks who are going to see what you do, attend one of your conferences, and not only a partner that you've identified over there, or a potential partner, but you want to maybe bring in the minister who has oversight over the area that can authorize registration. Can you bring that person in? Can you pay for their hotel? Can you pay for their flight? Can you have them bring their spouse or significant other? Can you treat them to a trip to Disney World on the side? All of those issues start delving into FCPA. If you bring someone over for a legitimate business reason and keep the scope narrowly defined with a nice agenda, usually you're fine. But it's when you start straying to say, yeah, sure, bring your whole family entourage and let's do the side trip to Vegas. Wouldn't that be fun? Not good. So those are the type of things. Obviously, they're very fact-specific. There are some advisory opinions that the Department of Justice has put out over the years. I would say that they're rather sparse given the number of years that the law has been in place, because people don't want to raise their hand and say, I have a friend with this issue, and then have a target on their back. But that being said, over the course of the years, the enforcement has been targeted less on organizations and more on the people in charge making those decisions. And so people are more willing to challenge the cases that have been brought, because people decide that they don't look good in stripes, and so they want to kind of fight back. So you can see some case law decision defining these various aspects. So just to touch on that, as I mentioned before, other national and international laws also apply and have been, I would say, increasing in frequency in terms of the number of laws in other countries that apply, as well as the level of cooperation between and amongst countries. These have been very big money makers for the government, frankly, these cases. And so there's been an incentive to increase the number with increased penalties and fines that can attach. Then it goes into the coffers where they can bring on more people to enforce them, hence more cases. So
we had a client who who worked in Serbia, and the Serbian person working for the organization reported very proudly to headquarters that he had managed to bribe one of the top government officials, and he reported that because he thought that was really good. So does it matter? So is that action attributed to the nonprofit if he is an employee? What if he's a volunteer? How does that?
So the first thing I would ask is, can you show me your anti-corruption policy? Because if you have a written policy that you can point to that says thou shalt not bribe, then that activity of that person, be it volunteer or employee, was acting beyond his authorized scope. First off, as your first line of defense, that's where I would start.
Right. So you throw that person to the wolves.
You throw that person to the wolves, and you say that they weren't operating in a manner that was consistent with their authorized scope.
And if you've been trained on that, it's probably even better.
Yeah, if you've been trained on that, if you have a certificate, that's been signed, or a attendance sheet that has been in support of that, all of that is good. And then you come down to the hard part of there's not a requirement within this law to report. So then you say, do we report or do we not report? And again, then it becomes kind of a whole analysis of, was it a one-off? Was it beyond the scope? Did you take corrective action? Do you feel like that was in place? Did it rise to the level that this will be known somehow or not? I mean, there's a whole strategic analysis that you have to undertake.
What kind of corrective action? Assuming that you don't go to the government official and ask for the money back, what are your other options?
So is that person still employed within your organization, or has that person who was volunteering of his or her time been, asked to move on and find another organization to perform their services? That's not to say that that's the only answer. We have seen instances on the commercial side where we've had a situation like this, and the person had been trained and, now had a better understanding as the implications of this law on the organization by virtue of their activities, and was put on notice and effectively, almost like a probation period, kept on and moved along, and that was fine. That particular case had both anti-corruption and an export control and sanctions issue. So that was a little bit of a sticky wicket, but you can move through things, but you have to, you have to analyze all the factors.
And document it.
Oh, document it, absolutely, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
I'll just add that this person, they did an investigation. They went to Serbia, did a full investigation, discovered that he didn't actually bribe the person. He just thought it would be so cool if he had. So it turned out he was lying. That was even better for the organization.
Yeah, great. That was of the former employee, right?
Yeah.
So as we touched upon, obviously you want to have your reporting and record keeping accurate. You want to be careful of like the side slush funds. Well, it's so hard to get money, so we're just going to keep a little, under the mattress type slush fund account locally. No, please no, because that can be problematic. Now, the good news in the example that Cindy brought to light was that the person came forward and reported. Wow, okay, that's an interesting reporting channel. Normally you don't see that. But you do want to have them educated so that they have an awareness, because a lot of times people say, those are those silly U.S. laws, but we're over here in, country X, so that they don't apply to us. And they don't really have an understanding of that. So you want to educate them. Again, your first line of defense. The other issue that we sometimes see are the anti-money laundering concerns. And people are also challenged with, well, we need to make payment to our local service providers. It's such a hassle to get money in and out. Can't we just carry a suitcase over and dole it out then? Honestly, these questions have been asked to us. Can we bring over suitcases of $20,000? First off, no, there are reporting requirements if you carry $10,000 or more. Secondly, from just a safety concern, I don't think that would be advisable. Thirdly, I love the airlines, but I don't know that I would trust them. I would have that strapped to my body.
I know. Note to self, if I have $30,000 in my bag, do not check my suitcase.
Yeah, don't check your suitcase, right? But there are certain reporting requirements that the U.S. Department of Treasury imposes, so you have to be mindful of that as well. And then, in addition, there are know your customer, which is sort of the broad speak of know the person, know your counterparty, know the people you're dealing with. Are they taking the monies and doing something that's unauthorized, where you just say, oh, okay, Joe, just take care of it, quote unquote, take care of it, by turning a blind eye. That also can get you into difficulty. So the other area that we see less often, but in certain parts of the world, are the anti-boycott issues that come up, where our U.S. Department of Commerce has a requirement that if you are asked to support a boycott, then you are required to report it, pardon me, whether or not you comply with that request. So if there is a, hey, whatever you do, don't use bank X, or don't use this shipping company, or don't use this particular organization, you have an obligation to report it whether or not you follow that. And in certain instances, there can be an IRS tax reporting obligation as well. That's less common and probably unlikely for your lines of business. So the anti-boycott, you do see it, and usually it's in kind of the fine print. So if you're dealing with service providers overseas, read the fine print, or have your team read the fine print, because usually that's where it's buried. Okay, some other things. Reporting to customs. So when you may recall that U.S. Customs is the first line of defense as people are coming and going from the U.S. There are different areas within customs. So part of it looks at the stuff that's being imported. Part of it looks at the people, so ICE. And they have pretty broad powers at the border, and they oftentimes serve as the front line for other government agencies. So in the instances of like the Treasury, you may recall as you go through, Dulles Airport, there's that form that you fill out. Are you carrying more than 10,000? If you say yes, then hello, Department of Treasury is going to come knocking on your door. But it's through the customs officials that serve as kind of the interface for that. So in that instance, where we see some issues are, the movement of funds from that perspective, and just the practical challenges of making or paying or receiving payment to support your local operation. We have an obligation to do the report, and if you say, okay, well, we've got three of us, this is another true example. Well, there are three of us coming through. We need to bring back the money because it really goes back to the organization here. It's $12,000. So if Sally, Joe, and I each take 4, are we good? No, you're not good, because collectively it's more than 10 with the intent of it going to an organization. So you can't split the payments. You can't try and evade. There is a reporting obligation. We have had instances where that has happened. They have inaccurately reported at the time at the border, and we recommended that they go in and disclose and do a correction, which then did not result in a penalty. So they have kind of, a clean and clear conscience. And notwithstanding the fact that they made a false statement at the border. But we cleaned it up, so it's all good. So those are some, kind of strange things. The other area that we see a lot, and I would say this is a challenging area more so today than it has ever been, and that is dealing with economic sanctions and the restrictions that apply. So these are historically, people in the U.S. would know, okay, I can't go to North Korea. I can't take a cruise, pleasure cruise to Cuba. I can't deal with Syria. So these are economic sanctions, and they are on, again, U.S. persons, broadly defined as people as well as entities, dealing in transactions, whether it's for-profit, not-for-profit, just having dealings with people, organizations, government entities, and the like in certain countries that are restricted. The easy ones are kind of the game 5, the big 5, Iran, Syria, Cuba, Sudan, North Korea. Those are effectively a thou shalt not, with the exception that there are some humanitarian allowances. So we have had several clients who perform humanitarian services and support globally that have had activities in these various countries. So you want to make sure that what you're doing there falls within the 4 corners of what is permissible. Because if not, there can be very significant sanctions and penalties that can apply. And these apply on what are called strict liability, meaning if the act happened and it wasn't authorized, it's a violation. Whether you had good intent, bad intent, meant to do it, didn't mean to do it, doesn't matter. So they can be challenging. And historically, the sanctions laws have been along the thou shalt not. Okay, so those are easy. I get that. Since the Obama administration, they developed and implemented more targeted sanctions. And the best example are the ones with regard to Crimea and the sanctions there, where it's thou shalt not do certain things with certain people in certain areas. So you have to have your facts together to make sure, what you're doing is authorized. And those can be more challenging as you're looking to provide services and support in certain countries. I think the thou shalt are easier, frankly, to implement. But the way of the world is, well, we don't want to put these blanket restrictions on. We want to go after the people we're trying to go after. So they're more challenging, I think, for implementation. With all of these sanctions programs, there are exceptions and exemptions for informational materials. There's some other, as I mentioned, exemptions and allowances for humanitarian aid, food aid, and the like. So again, depending upon the nature of your activities, there may be an ability to do that, but you also have to be mindful of what else do we need in order to support our activities there. So we had one organization several years back who was doing some humanitarian work in Sudan and some rather tricky and remote places, and they needed to have their personnel go out with satellite phones and some other kind of remote equipment so that they could ensure that they've got clear communications back from a safety perspective, from just a mission perspective as well. And so while their activities in that area were authorized, the satellite phone itself was export controlled, and so they had to get licenses in order to allow their people to go out with that. And obviously you want to think those issues through before you're jumping on the plane at national and, heading overseas. So the export control laws can also apply to your activities. And whether you're sending something, whether you're bringing it in your carry-on, it doesn't matter. If it's being, sent or released or exported, the laws will attach and apply. So if you've got, most things aren't controlled, but if you've got some technology that you need to bring, if you've got some software, you have to be mindful of whether or not that's controlled. Okay, foreign law considerations. Obviously, we've been focused mostly on the U.S. law provisions because there is just a boatload to talk about from the U.S. perspective. But obviously, you want to be mindful of whatever considerations from a foreign law perspective as well. Additional currency cash flow considerations or restrictions. Is there a license requirement? Are there certain prohibitions on the movement of currency? Are you permitted or prohibited from bringing money back out of the country? So you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding as to what restrictions may apply locally. And then I would also say, we've seen this more, you want to give some thought to, are there any national policy concerns in your targeted country where you want to perform services? We have seen, for example, in India over the last several years, there have been some areas where they're not favored. And so if a nonprofit wants to go in and perform certain services in a particular area that's not favored, we know in China, if organizations are going to go in and try and enlist membership by effectively soliciting for membership dues and the like, that's not cool and not permitted. So you want to also think from a high level policy perspective, are there any considerations? Now, conversely, there may be some that are restrictive, or there may be some that, this is an area that the government wants support and openly encourages and welcomes the support, certainly from international organizations, and prominent U.S. entities would be welcome. So it can be both a blessing and a curse, depending upon the nature of your activities. We do see, I would say now we're in more of a protectionist era than I've seen in the past. Whereas before it would be, well, we've got this great organization and we've got this great mission. We've done really good work here in the U.S. We want to, take the band on the road, if you will. I think you have to think more carefully today about what sort of environment you're in globally in a particular country. Okay, compliance considerations. I know we're getting near the end, and I want to make sure I've got some time left for questions. But your compliance considerations, I think from a high level, you want to think about a regulatory restriction and a contractual restriction, because usually both of those will apply. So in our in our discussion about kind of the anti-corruption, you've got kind of the regulatory is what I'm doing restricted from a legal perspective. And then you've also got, okay, what are my contractual obligations with the service providers? So you want to think through that both from a U.S. law perspective as well as the local considerations. But, you know, bear that in mind. You might get two different answers. One might be fine from a regulatory perspective, but you might, you know, have a bad outcome from a practical standpoint, you know, contractually with the entity that you're dealing with. So, you know, go back and review your contracts and see, you know, to make sure that they're well aligned for what your ultimate mission is. And then I think just generally areas where I would say to have a particular focal point would be dispute resolution. Most activities overseas, you know, abhor U.S. law and U.S. courts. They're afraid of it. So generally what you see is you don't also want home cooking in the country you're going to. So typically people will settle on, you know, an international arbitration, an ICC arbitration set in London. You want to have it in English language so you can hopefully understand what's going on. Those types of considerations. They aren't necessarily cheaper and faster as kind of the myth used to be, but oftentimes they're more acceptable to your overseas parties because, frankly, people are afraid of the U.S. forum. The compliance with laws, you want to make sure that you've got that in there. So compliance with laws, so there's an acknowledgement of all the laws and stuff that you are subject to, so that if there's a breach, you can, again, kind of put your arm out and say, well, the activities you undertook were beyond that and therefore not authorized. The governing law, you obviously want to have a conflicts of law provision. If you say the law of New York will apply, and if you don't have the excluding conflicts of law provisions, the New York law maybe would say, well, it's a place of performance and you're performing in Dubai. So, you know, welcome to a new set of laws. So you want to make sure you've got that. You want to think about whether you're working with an agency or an independent contractor, an agency being an agent of the principal. So they're an extension of you. Independent contractor, you've got a little more objectivity. I've got my long arm pushing out. IP, what we see in IP is oftentimes it's first use. So first use and first to file. So, you know, your fabulous go-hung new representative in country A may run to the copyright office and sign everything up in his or her name, and then you have to negotiate to get your IP back without recognizing that. So that's another area that we see. Termination provisions, it's super easy to sign people up and it's very difficult to get rid of them. So make sure you've got termination provisions. I would certainly recommend for people starting an engagement with a new person or entity in country to do it for a finite time that is then renewable, not an open-ended. So you have the ability and authority to cut it off if it's not working as successfully as you think. And then we always like to also work with local counsel to make sure that there are we understand kind of the local nuances and interpretations. So that's just kind of a high-level snapshot, but just wanted to go through those. I have on the screen a couple of examples. I'll just zip through these quickly.
That's the best part. We want to hear about
Yeah, so some of these, I mean, I've tipped a couple of them as I've been speaking, but these are ones that have come. Request to over-invoice or double invoice. So they'd be like, okay, so thanks our service provider. We know we're paying them, you know, $10,000, but can you really invoice it for $20,000? It would really help them out with their, you know, tax considerations or who knows what. So double invoicing, that's a red flag. Be careful of that. Usually it's to avoid restrictions on currency movement and the like. You can also be caught up in an aiding and abetting operation if you undertake and participate in their quote unquote scheme or their good idea. And we've seen it both over invoicing, under invoicing. It kind of goes both ways depending upon what they're trying to achieve. Request to pay in a bank that's outside of the country. Oftentimes we see representatives who have a bank account in the country where you're having them perform their services, but they may also hold another bank account in a lovely island in a warm spot where there are, you know, umbrella drinks readily available. That should be a tip-off if, in fact, they ask you to pay them in an offshore account or even, frankly, in an account that's beyond their particular jurisdiction. Be careful of that. And also be careful of payment to middlemen, where they just say, okay, we'll make this check out to so-and-so. And you say, well, but that's not your name. So again, avoid that. These should be kind of red flag gut checks, but these are actual issues that have come up that we have seen. And then again, the cash mule warnings, like we see this a lot. It is really, it's surprising how much you see this. The ask for people from the headquarters office, heading over to the local branch office, hey, it's easier if you just bring us the money. It's like, it still kind of boggles my mind, but we get that frequently. So, and to that point, you want to make sure that you educate your team, inform them as to why they can't do it. It's not just, you don't want to be convenient to your local chapter, but there are real implications that can result.
These are the same people who on their personal time send money to Nigerian princes.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to flip this slide to questions and open it up, see if anyone either on the line or in the room have any questions. Yes, sir.
With regard to filing for business license in the jurisdiction, in general, so we're working on a project where we'll be sending some U.S. citizens over to another country, subject matter experts, consultants, if you will. We will not set up an office over there. We will not pay them over there. We're not going to be buying stuff over there with the exception of perhaps hotel rooms.
Okay.
The country does not require any visa for U.S. citizens, whether for business or tourism, for up to 90 days. They'll only be there for weeks at a time. So in that, and they may be going back from time to time, but is that something, are there any licenses or registrations that in general we should be aware of?
Right. So you have a friend. No.
No, these will probably be independent consultants, so they're probably not our employees.
Okay. So
independent contractors that we'll sub to.
Right. So you have some folks who will be independent contractors who will sub to the organization, looking to effectively do some scope work. So they won't effectively have a permanent establishment.
Basically professors, and they're going to be mentoring students on a U.S. DoD funded project.
Right. Okay. So you had me at DoD. So I think for the most part, them performing their activities there would not require registration. You don't have, a desk and a phone effectively. You don't have a permanent establishment, which usually rises to the level of those registration requirements. I think the fact that it's U.S. government sanctioned is helpful, but it might also raise the specter of an awareness for it. So I would suggest confirming the understanding that you don't need to register there. From what I'm hearing, you wouldn't. Okay. But I would probably just do a double check with local counsel to make sure that there isn't some little strange hook of that. Generally, someone going in periodically, less than 90 days, be mindful of how much time they're spending. If it's just in a hotel room, they're not setting up a shop where they've got, a phone that can be called or some other contact, more permanent contact within the country. Then it doesn't sound like it would rise to the level of registration.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Yes.
Can you flip that if you were engaging 1099 consultants in the country to do whatever, training for less than 90 days, and anything, shouldn't you in the agreement to engage them, say, put them on the hook, say they need to rep and warrant that they have all applicable permits to do whatever you're asking them to do, or is there anything else?
Yeah, no.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is kind of flip the scenario that we just discussed and say if you've got some contractors in the country who are going to be doing some training and the like, as part of that agreement, you would certainly want to, establish them as an independent contractor, so they're not an agent on behalf of the organization. You would certainly want to put that their activity would be effectively a condition precedent would be their compliance with any local law and requirement. So over and out to them to figure it out and make sure that they've got it right. To the extent that they're performing that type of service, that that's different than if you say, okay, well, they're going to be housed, in this building and they'll be available from 9 to 5, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, then you're starting to creep into the gray zone of where there is more of a physical presence. If it's going to be more ad hoc, if it's a one-time certainly like a training thing. I would be careful on the contract terms though, but I would certainly include all of that and put the burden on them for compliance with local laws.
I think that's all we have time for, but Lindsay, if you can click forward 2 slides. I want to mention that our next program in March 11th, will be on the unrelated business income tax. You know, we're all in a place where nonprofits are looking for money under every rock and stone, and as they think of new ways, new and exciting and creative ways, that can have tax consequences. Just because you think you're tax exempt, you're only tax exempt when you're acting like you're tax exempt. So we have 2 great speakers coming in. You know, my colleagues here at Venable, so look for that. And in the meantime, please join me. And I think that if you have questions you didn't want to ask in the group, I think Lindsay will be here for another couple of minutes. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Lindsay for that very informative presentation.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.